After the summer that we just had, the past few months, it's very difficult to convince people that there is hope in our climate future. But this is something as science communicators and conservation communicators we have to do each and every day. And hope is where it's at. We've seen it in movies. We've seen it in messages. We've seen it in ocean optimism everywhere. Hope is the answer, and communicating that hope is something that we're going to talk about on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is a podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And today is Wednesday, and we are going to be talking about how to speak up for the ocean. And something that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately is how do we convince people that there is hope in the future of our planet, that there is hope in the future of our climate, when we just had one heck of a summer of insane fires, droughts, floods, everything that you can, hurricanes, cyclones, everything that you could think of that could happen in terms of a natural disaster was exaggerated and exacerbated by climate change. Everything. You saw the sea surface temperature heating up to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. We saw chloral bleaching happening all over the world. These are things that happen. And when, the news covers it, they like to point that out. It's, something that we have to point out every once in a while. When I cover climate change, a lot of the times I'm covering climate change when we're seeing a lot of droughts. We're seeing these natural disasters happen. We're talking about how it affects people, how it affects money, and how governments spend their money. And also talking about politicians who aren't paying attention to climate change. There's a lot of negative news out there around climate, as there should be. We're in one heck of a situation that's not good. We need to better that. But there is hope and there are changes. And one of the best things that I have seen in a long time that actually gave me even more hope were a couple of things that were going on within just like social media. And that's where I love to see people kind of hang out, is in social media. And there is a creator, especially that I'm thinking about right now, named Elena Wood, and she's on TikTok. If I go to her profile on TikTok, as I'm looking at her video right now, it is The Garbage Queen, at The Garbage Queen. And she talks a lot about climate change, but she has this segment on her climate change talking about climate optimism, the good things that happen within climate, and covering stories where people are fighting climate change, either as a group of students who are suing, the state government and winning, or there are people making policy changes that are going to make it better for our future. There's always something going on. So if you really have a chance, go over to TikTok, follow at The Garbage Queen. I'll put the link in the show notes, because this is somebody who's taking the time out to find good news around climate. And I'll be honest, it's not easy sometimes to find good news. And so this is a person who is providing hope on a platform where she gets many, many people in front of her. She right now has 381,000.6 followers on TikTok, over 11 million likes. And it's somebody that I think, you should follow. Somebody that I think will give us hope. If you are having trouble finding where we can get climate optimism from, this is one of the people that you can find it, because she covers good things about climate in terms of reducing climate, good policies, good projects, good wins that we've seen. And even though there are some bad things that she talks about climate change, she still talks about a lot of good. And I think that's something that is very admirable and not easy to do, but is something that I think we should be doing more of. And today I'm going to be covering a story out of NPR that was posted on September 26th in 2023. And it's really talking about an international energy agency, the IEA report that just came out. The agency, which represents a bunch of countries that make up more than 80% of the global energy consumption, projects that demand for coal, oil, and natural gas will peak before 2030. And you're probably like, well, hold on a second, that's not great. No, the demand is going to peak because we really need it, because energy is going to be a problem right now. But the peak is earlier than we thought. So we're going to, what happens after a peak? There's a decrease, right? A pretty steep one as well. And so because that peak is early, that's a bit of a good thing. Even though greenhouse gases are, keep rising, the IEA report finds that there's still a path to reaching net zero emissions by 2050 and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And so that's the number we need to avoid that's the number we needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change, such as catastrophic flooding, heat waves, and deadly heat waves. So that's the good news, is that we can still get there. So in addition to the optimism, in 2021, the overall message was less optimistic, right, out of the net zero roadmap that they had. So the 2023 version shows that the transition from fossil fuels to cleaner forms of energy will have to speed up even more in the coming decade, but it's better. So for example, the world is on track to spend 1.8 trillion on clean energy this year, but to meet that target outlined in 2015 Paris Climate Agreement among the world's nations, the IEA finds that an annual spending would have to more than double to 4.5 trillion by the early 2030s. I think we can get there. As renewable energy costs continue to decline, the IEA says tripling installations of new renewable energy, mostly solar and wind power, will be the biggest driver of emissions reductions. But the agency also warns countries will have to speed up permitting and improve their electricity grids for that power to get where it's needed. So here we go. So this is now where we get into, the thick of things, right? Where we're saying we need to improve our infrastructure for using electricity, for using wind power, for using solar power. We'll have to increase our ability to create batteries that can store said energy, right? And we're going to have to reduce our reliance on and demand for oil and gas projects. Now, this report comes as countries are preparing to meet at the annual climate summit in Dubai, which I find very ironic because the Middle East is a big place for oil and gas. Now, of course, even though oil is running thick down there in the Middle East, this is a good place to have it because you want to have these types of conversations to move towards, clean energy and renewable energy. Now, at the end of November, this is when the climate summit is going to happen. And now it's happening amid calls of phasing out fossil fuels entirely. So as some person says for Greenpeace, Kaiser Kosunan said, it's an extraordinary moment in history. We now have all the tools needed to free ourselves from the planet heating fossil fuels, but there's still no decision to do it. So this is a problem. The oil and gas industry continues to argue that it can be part of addressing climate change, even though research says most oil, gas, and coal reserves would have to stay in the ground. The American Petroleum Institute has offered a defense of its business and in the response to this report. It says policymakers should not ignore current market realities, which is clearly calling for the need for more supply of oil and natural gas in favor of any scenario models with predetermined outcomes. So they're saying that, hey, look, we still need a reliance on oil and gas. And in fact, it's actually increasing. So now if the countries fail to achieve their climate goals, there's going to be, the report warns that carbon removal will be necessary. And even though carbon removal will be necessary, removing carbon from the atmosphere can be very costly, and we must do everything possible to stop it there in the first place. So here's where it comes to play when we talk, and in conservation, we talk about this all the time. It's better to be proactive than reactive. When you're proactive, you're protecting a piece of ocean, a piece of land, and you can protect that as a marine protected area, as a terrestrial protected area, and then you're protecting it so you don't have to go back and restore it. You don't have to become reactive, where you destroy an area and then you have to restore it back. Restoring is expensive. Restoring is super, super expensive. I remember working for the government of Canada for fisheries and oceans, and when we had to restore something underwater, just even putting rocks down underwater to transport those rocks, to bring them to make fish habitat, was in the hundreds of thousands of dollars right off the bat. That's extremely expensive when you're talking about, creating fish habitat in the Great Lakes or in some of the rivers that connect the Great Lakes. This is the reactive approach. When we're talking about climate change, carbon removal is the reactive approach. It's the restoring of the atmosphere by taking out carbon dioxide. That carbon removal is expensive, and it's not even proven yet. We talk about blue carbon. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done to find out whether sinking blue carbon, like sinking algae, sinking, plants, like underwater plants like mangroves, as well as seagrasses, as well as kelp and sargassum. We're finding out if that actually is good for the environment to constantly take large quantities of this algae, of this aquatic algae or plants, and sink them as they store carbon and bring it down to the ground or to the bottom of the ocean. We don't know if that's really a great idea in large quantities. There's talked about iron fertilization, where we're trying to fertilize the ocean with iron to build up the amount of phytoplankton that's in the water, to say, hey, you know what, let's get this phytoplankton that will take up more carbon dioxide to take out the carbon dioxide in the water or in the atmosphere. But what happens when you have a lot of phytoplankton? You get a lot of algae. And when you get a lot of algae, that algae eventually will die at some point in time, and it'll sink to the bottom. When it sinks to the bottom, the microbial loop starts to do its work and starts to break down the phytoplankton. And during that process, that microbial process, oxygen is used up. So then the bottom of the ocean could be used up of oxygen, and that's not a good thing. We don't want to get in that situation. Then it becomes hypoxic, and that's a problem. So trying to take out carbon dioxide should be our last resort. We should still look at it as a possibility, look at it as something that could happen in small quantities, but it should not be our mainstay. It should be part of the plan, but not our mainstay. Restoration will be needed and carbon removal will be needed, but it's extremely expensive. We don't know if it works. We don't want to take that chance. The best thing to do is avoid putting it in the first place. That's lower our reliance on oil and gas and coal, and increasing our reliance on renewable energy, transportation, electric transportation, and so forth, right? I always find it interesting when I speak to people about EVs. I have an EV. I have a Tesla. I'm very fortunate to be able to have one. And I find that when people start to talk to me, about Teslas, like, oh, you're a Tesla driver, you're a man driving an EV. How unmanly of you, which I find very interesting. They're saying it doesn't go the distance. There's a lot of myths about EVs, and then they're like, well, if you put a gas-powered vehicle compared to an electric vehicle, the gas-powered vehicle is actually better because of the way it's made, the battery and everything like that. But they always tend to forget to put in the emissions of the actual gas-powered car. When you look at two brand new cars, one EV, one gas-powered car, when you take into account everything, you take into account the emissions done by the petroleum car, or you look at the EV, and you look at the EV battery life and the way it's discharged, the better option is the EV every single time when you're looking at new versus new, same as used versus used, right? So now, we're getting in more into EVs. We're seeing more EVs available. We're seeing the distances increase, the ranges increase on EVs. We're seeing trucks that are now EVs and SUVs that are now EVs, and more brands are coming out with electric vehicles. These are things that we need, and we need to continue to push them. More people are going to buy them as they get more and more reliable. I've had it for a year and a half, and it's fantastic. I love it. I don't know if I'd buy a second car that's not EV, to be honest. Anyway, but that's here nor there. But this is, things that we have to consider. We have to, the whole point though of this report is there's optimism. There's a lot of work we need to do, and we're in a bind as a world, as a planet, but we need to look at the optimism. There is hope. We're seeing countries change to renewable energy faster than we've ever seen before. We still need a lot more work. We still need more infrastructure. We still need more spending, but we're getting there. We're on our way, and that's what's good. And there is hope, and there is optimism in there. And if you look at hope, a lot of movies, a lot of TV shows, a lot of stories are built on hope, are built on optimism. The Star Wars movies are built all on hope. In fact, one of them, I think, is A New Hope, is named, based on hope. Hope is what drives us. Hope is what motivates us. And, to look for and hear about climate hope allows us to say, look, we're not out of the thick of things, but we're on our way. We're getting there. And as a planet, as a people, as a species, we can get there and we can do more. And that's what's going to be needed to get out of this. And I believe we can do it. And articles like this, people like the Garbage Queen, they are people that can really help move things along and really help in our future, really help solidify our future, and really help think that, to our kids, to young people, to middle-aged people, to older people, that we could have a better future for our ancestors. And I think that's really, really important. So that's the episode for today. I'd love to hear your comments on this, on climate hope and hope in general when we talk about science communication. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to DM me at How to Protect the Ocean on Instagram, at How to Protect the Ocean. And if you want to get a hold of me on my website, speakupforblue.com is the website. Go to the contact us page, fill out the form. It goes right to my email. Or you can leave me a voice message. I'd love to hear your voice. Just the bottom page, bottom right-hand corner, there's a microphone. Just click on that. Leave your voice message. I'd love to hear your voice, and I will reply. But other than that, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.